Welcome to the second step of the vendor onboarding process, filling out the vendor packet. We will go through a few different examples to show different packet customization options. But first, a recap of the first step in the vendor onboarding process. First, an internal user needs to request that a new vendor be added to the portal, and that request needs to be approved. To learn more about the new vendor request process, please watch our video on new vendor requests. To begin the vendor packet process, a vendor receives an email from the vendor portal prompting them to register for an account. Fill out the required information and you will be taken to the home page of the portal. There, you can find a link to your vendor packet in the vendor onboarding card at the top of the home page. For our first example, we have a simple packet that includes 4 sections: addresses, contacts, payment information, and tax information. These sections and the information within them are driven by your organization's requirements, objectives, and the information on the vendor request. This client's focus was on collecting the information needed to set up a vendor in the ERP in order to process and pay invoices. The address section is driven largely by which ERP you have, as well as internal processes. For this client, there can be only one headquarters address and must have at least one remit address, which can be the same address as headquarters. Each address is validated through an integration with a third-party service. For the contacts section, at least one AR contact is needed, but multiple contacts and contact types can be added. For the payment information section, there is information about payment terms, followed by a drop-down asking if credit card payments are processed without fees. This is a conditional section. If you say yes to this section, you will be prompted to enter your virtual card information. If you choose no, you will be prompted to enter your ACH information. Our clients use this section of the packet to prioritize their preferred payment methods. This client achieves this by only giving 2 options for payment methods, and the vendor is told to contact the client if they can't support one of those 2 options. The tax information section walks you through a digital version of a W-9. This is the only section where customizations aren't allowed, since it needs to follow the fields of a W-9 exactly. Additionally, this client has TIN check validation available. After all sections have been filled out, hit the Submit button to submit the packet. For our second example, there are 6 sections instead of 4: company information, addresses, contacts, insurance, payment information, and tax information. Again, these sections and the questions inside are completely customizable to your organization's vendor onboarding requirements. The expanded information allowed this client to meet their objectives of incorporating a new process and organizing workflows that span multiple departments and their needs. The first section is company information, where a vendor adds relevant company information such as D&B numbers, whether they are US-based, or questions that may impact packet behavior in later sections. For example, the answer to this question impacts insurance requirements in the later tab. The second is addresses. Similar to our last example, there is information on how to correctly fill this section out, including specifying that there is only one corporate address needed as well as one remit address. You can choose address type, and then, once you've filled the address in, there's a validate button. The third section is contacts. In this example's case, it's required to have a contact of each type. The types of contacts and requirements for each are entirely based on the information that your organization needs to collect. Next is the insurance section. For this section, either a vendor must upload the required COIs or request a waiver to bypass this requirement. The insurance section is reviewed internally by the risk team, which can send the packet back to the vendor if the waiver isn't accepted. In the case of this company, 3 different types of insurance may be required, and each must be accounted for before the step is considered complete. By collecting expiration dates, the solution can track when new COIs are needed, but more on that later. There are also guardrails in place to ensure that the policy expiration date is in the future. The next section is payment information. This organization wants to drive ACH adoption, so it incentivizes future vendors by offering specific terms to achieve this. The tax section for this client is the same as before, as it needs to follow the W-9 form exactly. There's also a TIN check validation here that uses the tax ID and the business name, so you'll need to click Validate before you move on to the next section of the packet. Once you have completed all the sections, hit Complete and submit the packet. Our final example has 11 sections: company information, addresses, contacts, insurance, payment information, tax information, product information, logistics, business classifications and diversity, data synchronization, and agreements. This broadline food distributor has tens of thousands of vendors, and it's paramount that the information collected from the vendor aligns with legal and risk requirements. Our client was looking to make sure that the information gathered and approval processes were as streamlined and organized as possible. The company information section has several conditional questions which may change the information you have to fill out depending on your answers. The address section looks similar to our other examples, but does have the question, "Have you recently moved?" as one difference. The contact section is also very similar to our other two examples, as you're able to choose contact types and add multiple contacts. The insurance section has more information up front compared to the other two examples. It also requires different types of insurance and has places to answer questions and upload documents. The payment information section has a little bit less work to do within the packet, as this organization decided they would prefer most of this to be done on the back end. Again, tax information is all the same since it's essentially the digital version of a W-9. Product information also has several conditionals. This is a great opportunity for customization and collecting information about things that aren't considered industry standard. In the logistics section of this packet, none of the information is required. This allows the vendors who need to fill out this information to complete it, while still letting vendors who don't to move on in the packet. Business classifications and diversity is a section that may be important to companies that value vendor and supply chain diversity. If this isn't a priority to your organization, it can be left off. The data synchronization section is another with a conditional, which you can see here. The agreements section presents agreements to vendors based on the goods or services offered, as well as answers to other questions in the company section. Vendors can download these and either agree to them or make changes and reattach. If agreements are changed, your team can review the new agreements in the next step. Finally, hit Submit to complete the packet. After the packet is submitted and approved by the client, there is an integration with DocuSign. The agreements are sent to DocuSign and their workflow takes over. Once fully executed, the signed agreements are returned to the portal, saved to the packet, and it moves to the final step of the process. Through ICG's vendor onboarding process, vendors can also update their existing packet. This ability is entirely customizable. Your organization can leave it off or decide the different sections vendors are allowed to update. Here's an example. This client allows vendors to update both addresses and payment information. To do this, vendors can go to the Vendor Updates card on the homepage. Here, vendors can update addresses that are already created. However, if changing the company name or adding a remittance address, an entirely new packet must be completed. To make updates, click the three dots in the corner of each address entry. Updating addresses requires a new validation. You can do the same thing to update payment information. Validations are in place on the back end based on client requirements to ensure the requests can't be submitted by people without the correct authorization. Other than that, the form is exactly the same as the original packet. In addition, if a vendor tries to make multiple changes in a short amount of time, the client's team is notified. Now, I'm going to show you another example where vendors can update insurance information, which is beneficial for maintaining compliance. The vendor portal tracks the expiration dates and, 45 days before the policy expiry date, sends the vendor an email. 15 days before expiration, vendors get another email, and yet another when it has expired. These timelines and the emails are entirely customizable to your organization's requirements. In the email, vendors receive a link to the portal, and an insurance update task is available to the user who submitted the packet. This link takes them back to their packet where they can upload a new COI and fill in the new information just as they did in the original packet process. Once an insurance update is submitted, it creates a risk task for your internal team to review. For organizations looking to streamline their onboarding process, vendor packets are crucial, and with ICG, customization to your organization's exact needs is possible, no matter how much or how little information you need to collect. And that concludes the vendor portion of our vendor onboarding process. In our next video, we'll discuss the final step of the vendor onboarding process, how the packet gets processed by an internal team.